2 years ago, the Taliban regained power in Afghanistan. Since then, many changes have occurred. This is just a guitar. It may seem wild to you, but in Afghanistan they are banned and they are burned in bonfires. And women are particularly no longer considered as humans. And the dress code for them now is only the burqa.
Afghanistan, a mountainous country in Central Asia, situated at the crossroads of important trade routes. Nearly all of Afghanistan's modern history has been an unending chain of major and minor military conflicts. Everyone has somehow grown accustomed to the fact that there is always war in Afghanistan. When there are no foreign troops in the country, Afghans engage in civil conflicts among themselves. When a foreign contingent appears, they rally against it. Except for brief periods, Afghanistan has been at war almost continuously. So why has this country become one of the hottest spots on the planet? Why does eternal war rage on Afghan soil? And who benefits from the constant instability in this region? Today, we discuss Afghanistan.
Watch this!
Afghanistan is a country with an ancient and eventful history. According to many scholars, Afghanistan referred to the Sanskrit term for a rider or horse. The indigenous people of the country spoke Indo-European languages. One of the oldest religions, Zoroastrianism, originated in Afghanistan, and its founder, Zoroaster, lived and died in the city of Balkh. The territory of modern Afghanistan was part of the Persian Empire, conquered later by Alexander the Great. Greeks, Scythians, Huns, various civilizations and peoples attempt to conquer these lands. During the early Common Era, the Great Silk Road passed through this region, connecting East Asia with the Mediterranean. Initially, Buddhism was the dominant religion in the region. Unique artifacts have survived since that era, including the two colossal Buddhas in Bamiyan Valley near Kabul. In the 7th century, the territory of modern Afghanistan was conquered by the Arabs, who introduced Islam. It marked a period of scientific and cultural flourishing. In the 13th century, the forces of Genghis Khan invaded the region, and it became part of the Mongol Empire, followed by the Timurid Empire. In the next century, Babur, a descendant of Timur, founded a new empire with its center in Kabul, and conducted victorious campaigns in India. In 1747, the first Afghan state was founded, with its capital in Kandahar, marking the beginning of modern Afghanistan. Thanks to its strategic location at the heart of Eurasia, Afghanistan became a battleground between two empires in modern times, the British and the Russian empires. This geopolitical rivalry period is often called the Great Game. Without engaging in open warfare, these two powers viewed for dominance in the region. The Russian Empire pursued an expansionist policy, conquered Central Asia, and justified its southern expansion as a need to protect against local rights. On the other hand, the British valued their prized possession, India, and were concerned about its defense against potential threats from Central Asia, historically the source of invasion into the subcontinent. At some point, they managed to avoid a confrontation. In 1801, Emperor Paul I of Russia supported Napoleon Bonaparte's idea of a joint campaign against the British in India. 20,000 Cossacks were dispatched to Central Asia a month before Paul's death. However, they received orders to return after Paul's overthrow and assassination. There is still a theory that Britain financed this conspiracy, as the British government took the Russo-French alliance and the potential invasion of India very seriously.
Watch this!
While Russia was conquering Central Asian territories and moving southward, Britain decided to establish political control over Afghanistan. Two bloody wars were needed to achieve this. Afghanistan was never directly a British colony like India. Still, from the second half of the 19th century, Afghan emirs from the Barakzai dynasty were politically dependent on London. In the early 20th century, the young Afghan movement emerged in the country, demanding independence. During World War I, Afghanistan remained neutral, despite attempts by Germany and the Ottoman Empire to involve it on their side. In 1919, Amanullah became the emir and shared the ideas of the young Afghan movement. Immediately after his ascension to the throne, Afghanistan declared independence from Britain, leading to the Third Anglo-Afghan War. This time, the attempt to subjugate Afghanistan was unsuccessful, and Britain was forced first to acknowledge partial and from 1926 complete independence for Afghanistan. Emir Amanullah became the king of the country. Soon after, the influence of a new superpower, the United States, began to replace British interests in the region. In the early 20th century, Afghanistan was a backward agriculture country with virtually no industry and impoverished population, half of whom were illiterate. Amanullah's reforms to modernize the country led to a rebellion in 1928 and a civil war. Chaos reigned in the country. King Amanullah lost his powers and turned to the USSR for military assistance. The Bolshevik regime that took control in Russia after 1917 retained Central Asia in its sphere of influence. A special military operation by the Red Army led to the capture of one Afghan province. However, after Amanullah fled the country, Soviet troops left. The special operation did not change the situation in Afghanistan.
Watch this.
From 1933, Afghanistan entered a period of stability and peace lasting for 40 years. King Zahir Shah aimed for political and economic independence for the country. Many Afghans remember his reign as a golden era for the nation. He invited foreign advisors, established the first university, granted women access to education and voting rights, allowed a free press, and instituted an elected parliament. As a skilled politician, King Zahir Shah maintained relations with the United States and the USSR, seeking dominance in the region. Zahir Shah also promoted culture and trade ties between Afghanistan and Europe. His famous quote was, "Nowhere in the Quran does it say that Allah is against scientific and technological progress, so why should we fight it?" During World War II, Afghanistan became a battleground for intense rivalry. After the war, the Afghan king established warm relations with the USSR and developed personal friendships with Soviet leaders. Khrushchev and Brezhnev often invited him on hunting trips. In 1973, a military coup occurred in the country, led by Zahir Shah's cousin Muhammad Daoud. After 40 years of Zahir Shah's rule, he surrendered and Afghanistan was declared a republic. Muhammad Daoud became the head of government and later became the first president of Afghanistan. He established an authoritarian dictatorship, which led to political instability. Daoud implemented no significant internal or economic reforms, and the living standards in the country did not improve. These were the last peaceful years in Afghanistan. Constant conspiracies and coup attempts characterized Daoud's dictatorship, and he was highly unpopular among the country's ethnic minorities. As early as 1965, journalist Nur Muhammad Taraki, influenced by communist ideas, founded the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. On April 27, 1978, a military coup resulted in the overthrow of Daoud. Representatives of the uprising arrived at the presidential palace and demanded his surrender. Daoud and 18 family members, including children and grandchildren, refused and were killed. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan played an active role in the coup and came to power. Since then, relatively peaceful times in Afghanistan have ended, and the country has experienced a series of unending armed conflicts.
Watch this.
After the April Revolution of 1978, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was proclaimed. Nur Muhammad Taraki became the head of state and prime minister, with Babur Karmal as his deputy, and the ruling party was the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA. Hafizullah Amin became the chairman of the Revolutionary Council. The revolution served as a prelude to a civil war. The new government initiated reforms to overcome Afghanistan's backwardness, but these reforms encountered resistance from Islamic opposition. The agrarian reform failed due to corruption, with the best lands plots going to the relatives of officials. A month after the revolution, the new government requested urgent Soviet advisors, including military, party, and economic advisors. KGB personnel also arrived to help establish the Republic's security agencies. However, when Afghanistan requested direct military assistance from the USSR in 1978, the Soviet Union declined. As a result of these developments, the revolutionary government rapidly lost its authority. Conservative Afghan society rejected the reforms, and 6 months after the revolution, Afghanistan descended into uprisings and protests, leading to a civil war. Islamic clergy rose against the new government, and rebel soldiers and officers began seizing cities and towns. Against this backdrop, on September 16, 1979, Amin removed Nur Muhammad Turaki from power. Later, he was secretly killed. Hafizullah Amin established a regime of personal dictatorship and sought to consolidate his power through terror and repression. His short rule was marked by intense political turmoil and internal conflicts. Amin was accused of executing tens of thousands of peaceful Afghans thrown into prisons. He had control over the largest prison in Afghanistan, Pul-e-Charkhi, built by Dawood. During the PDPA rule, mass executions occurred near this prison. Later, during the Taliban era, more than 100,000 people passed through it.
Watch this.
Both the internal and external policies of Amin were a source of dissatisfaction for the Soviet Union. He was seen as an unreliable partner who could potentially align with the West at any moment. Amin's contacts with Pakistan became known for the rising concerns in Moscow. The Soviet leadership decided to remove Amin from power and install a puppet communist government in Afghanistan. An attempt to poison the Afghan leader failed. Consequently, on December 27, 1979, units of the KGB and the Soviet army stormed the royal palace and eliminated Amin. Moscow-controlled Babur Karmal became the new leader. After his resignation in 1986, Muhammad Najibullah took over the Afghan government. 2 days before Amin's removal, the Soviet military intervention in Afghanistan began. The initial plan was to strengthen Afghan government forces and help suppress the turmoil in the country, with Moscow aiming for a quick operation similar to the one in Czechoslovakia, which was occupied in 20 days. However, events unfolded differently. There was armed resistance to the invasion of the Soviet Union, which dragged on for a long and challenging 10 years. Afghan Mujahideen groups were formed, with Mujahideen meaning defenders of the faith, fighting for their religion. Afghans regarded Soviet soldiers as infidels and viewed their struggle as jihad. Guerrilla warfare was their primary tactic. The war occurred in a mountainous country, where the terrain often favored the Mujahideen. The Soviet Union spent vast sums on the operation, and its objectives were unclear to the Soviet people. In typical Russian fashion, the occupation of neighboring country was not referred to as a war. Instead, they invented a term, the limited contingent of Soviet troops in Afghanistan. Following Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power and several years of deliberations, the decision was made to withdraw Soviet forces from Afghanistan. Soviet losses were over 15,000 soldiers killed, with an additional 18,000 casualties on the government side. The insurgents suffered around 90,000 deaths. The exact number of Afghan civilians killed in the war is unknown. Still, it varies between 700,000 and 2 million, according to different researchers. The Afghan War became one of the main preconditions for the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Watch this.
After the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, the civil war did not cease. On the contrary, it flared up with a renewed vigor. The departure of Soviet soldiers encouraged the opposition to intensify military actions against the pro-Soviet regime of Najibullah. However, the USSR continued massive deliveries of arms, ammunition, fuel and food to Afghanistan, and Soviet military advisors remained in the country. Thanks to all of this, government forces managed to contain the armed groups of the Mujahideen for another 3 years. Najibullah's government could withstand the opposition as long as the USSR existed. After its dissolution starting from January 1, 1992, military and economic assistance to Kabul ceased. Subsequently, the Afghan Republic's army could not resist the advance of the Mujahideen. Kabul was captured in April 1992. The Afghan Republic stopped its existence, so the employees of the Russian embassy and advisors left the territory. Najibullah sought refuge in the UN missions building, where he stayed until 1996. The Mujahideen proclaimed the establishment of the Islamic State of Afghanistan. The international community recognized it, hoping for peace in the country after the expulsion of the communist regime. The leader of the Mujahideen, Sabhatullah Mujahidi, became the president. His power was nominal because former brothers in arms immediately began to fight among themselves. Afghanistan once again turned into a fragmented state. Various ethnic groups, Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, continued to fight against each other. The country entered a new phase of a civil war. In the struggle for power among the Mujahideen commanders, repeated bombings occurred in Kabul. A large number of the city's culture and historical monuments were destroyed. Afghanistan once again resembled feudal principalities engaged in constant warfare. In addition, militants began to fight for opium fields, which significantly contributed to their economy. Drugs in Afghanistan are a significant part of the shadow economy. The country's narcotics production began to grow in the late 1980s. Today, virtually all heroin on the international black market originates from Afghanistan. According to various estimates, the profits from the production and sale of drugs in the early 21st century accounted for up to 60% of Afghanistan's GDP.
Watch this.
By 1994, Afghanistan, fragmented and war-torn, lay in ruins. At this point, a new leader of the militants emerged unexpectedly, a religious cleric named Mullah Muhammad Ammar. He had previously fought against the Soviet Union as a part of the Mujahideen, but now created his movement and called it the Taliban, which translates to students. Under his leadership, Mullah Ammar united Afghans weary of war. The Taliban's goal was to establish a caliphate and to govern according to Sharia law. The Taliban quickly launched offensives and began capturing regions of the country. In September 1996, they entered Kabul and founded the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Their first action in the capital was the brutal execution of Najibullah, who had sought refuge in the UN mission building. Only Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and Chechen separatists recognized the legitimacy of the new state. Sharia law was enforced in the areas under their control, and Afghanistan regressed into medieval practices. Alcohol, music, cinema, television, European clothing, and much more were banned. Criminals faced public executions and amputations of limbs. Throughout the 5 years of the Taliban's existence, the freedom and rights of Afghans were restricted and violated. Women were forbidden to work, study, or even go out without a male escort. The Taliban considered the Jain Buddha statues in the Bamiyan Valley as pagan idols and decided to destroy them. Despite protests from the international community, these unique historical monuments were demolished in March 2001. Despite the strict adherence to Sharia norms, Afghanistan continued to be a center for drug trafficking. For economic sustenance, the country exported hundreds of thousands of tons of opium. However, the Taliban could not end the war or establish complete control over Afghan territory. Several field commanders formed the so-called Northern Alliance and fought against the new regime. One civil war transitioned into another. One of the Northern Alliance leaders was Afghan Field Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud. He served as Afghanistan's Minister of Defense after the fall of Najibullah and before the Taliban's rise to power. He managed to garner support from various Western countries and Russia, received new weapons and controlled 25% of the country's territory. These areas primarily consist of several provinces with a population of 5.5 million, mainly ethnic Tajiks. However, the main blow to the Taliban was not delivered by the alliance, but rather by their short-sighted decisions.
Watch this.
The regime provided shelter and support to radical Islamic movements worldwide. One of them was Al-Qaeda. Requests for the extradition of the terrorist leader Osama bin Laden were made even after the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. The Taliban refused. The attacks on September 11, 2001 were the last straw. After another refusal to extradite the #1 terrorist, Operation Enduring Freedom began, with the United States playing the leading role. A NATO military contingent ousted the Taliban regime and drew them out of the country. The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was declared in Kabul. Hamid Karzai, leader of the Pashtun tribe, became the interim and later the elected president of Afghanistan. In 2001, no one anticipated this was just the beginning of a new war, which would become the longest war in US history, lasting 20 years. The militants retreated to the Pakistani region of Waziristan, displaced the government there, and effectively took control of the area. Osama bin Laden was only eliminated in 2011. The Taliban transformed into an underground organization and engaged in terrorist activities. They carried out suicide attacks, hotel assaults, bombings in crowded places, and much more. Additionally, the Taliban initiated aggression against the international military forces. Although the US announced the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan after eliminating Osama bin Laden, it took 10 more years to accomplish. Year by year, the Taliban conducted increasingly audacious terrorist acts. In addition to all this, an ISIS cell emerged in Afghanistan. They opposed both the Taliban and the international military forces. As a result, the US engaged in negotiations with the Taliban in 2019. The Taliban promised not to cooperate with Al-Qaeda and other extremist organizations. At the same time, the US was supposed to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. Immediately after the withdrawal of the international contingent from Afghanistan in May 2021, the Taliban launched an offensive against the government forces. Military analysts initially estimated that the official authorities and President Ashraf Ghani would hold out for another 2 years. However, within 3 months, the Taliban captured the entire country. On August 15, 2021, they took the capital. The president fled the country. Thousands of people at Kabul airport tried to leave the country on American military transport planes. In desperation, people climbed onto the wings and landing gear, resulting in casualties. Ukraine significantly assisted in evacuating Afghan refugees by sending its aircraft to Kabul. Foreign journalists, human rights activists, women and children, more than 650 people in total, were evacuated by the Ukrainian Air Force. Some commentators compared the fall of Kabul to the fall of Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975.
Watch this.
After capturing Kabul, the Taliban proclaimed the creation of the Second Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Haibatullah Akhundzada became the emir. Within a month, the new authorities banned girls from attending secondary school and women from showing their faces. The Taliban removed all women from government positions, and working in non-governmental organizations was prohibited as well. In December 2022, all-female education, including primary education, was banned. Taliban patrols prevented women from entering the university buildings, so they took to the streets in demonstrations, which were dispersed with whips and sticks. According to the Global Gender Gap Index report, Afghan women were the most oppressed globally. 1 year after the Taliban came to power, Human Rights Watch reported a new humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. The economic collapse reduced international aid and drought exacerbated hunger in the country. Medical services in the country were also in a dire state. It's worth noting that women can only receive treatment from female doctors, and there is often a shortage of them. Most medicines are smuggled into the country and come at high prices. In November 2022, the Taliban reintroduced the gruesome form of execution known as public stoning for criminals and those deemed to have violated moral standards. Suspects of theft, adultery, homosexuality, and other offenses were brought to crowded stadiums and beaten with sticks. The Taliban is implementing its version of Sharia law in Afghanistan, and sometimes their laws are peculiar and discriminatory. In some provinces, they have banned shaving birds and playing non-religious music. As part of their campaign against music, the Taliban publicly burned musical instruments and equipment. In February 2023, the two largest cities in Afghanistan, Mazar-i-Sharif and Kabul, banned the sale of contraceptives. In July, the Taliban closed all hair salons and beauty parlors. It was one of the last opportunities for women to work and socialize.
Watch this.
As of September 2023, no state de jure has recognized the Taliban government as legitimate. However, in practice, at least 5 countries maintain relations with the new regime: China, Turkmenistan, Iran, Pakistan, and of course Russia. They have accredited diplomatic representatives of the Taliban. Immediately after the Taliban's second return to power, Russia established contacts with them, attempting to keep this engagement low profile on the global stage. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russian leadership was in political isolation. Engaging with Afghanistan can demonstrate to their domestic audience that Moscow still holds diplomatic weight worldwide. Russians are unlikely to be bothered by their remaining friends being authoritarian and terrorist regimes. Additionally, in the context of sanctions, Afghanistan becomes an additional market for selling cheap Russian goods. In September 2022, Russia and the Taliban agreed on the supply of petroleum products and grain to Afghanistan. It marked the first international economic agreement with the Taliban since their takeover. Furthermore, the Russian embassy in Kabul continues to operate. In contrast, many countries withdrew their diplomatic representations after the Taliban's second takeover. Nothing is surprising about Russia's cooperation with the Taliban regime. Two essentially terrorist regimes will always find common ground and understanding. However, a paradox emerged as Russia banned the Taliban as a terrorist organization. Yet Moscow invites Taliban representatives to the Kremlin and conducts negotiations with their foreign ministers. In August 2023, the global information space received funny news that the Russian authorities intended to discuss counterterrorism efforts with the Taliban, a group prohibited in their own country. It's a dystopian scenario worthy of George Orwell's pen.
Watch this.
Modern Afghanistan, under the rule of the Taliban, remains an archaic and undeveloped country, with the majority of its population residing in rural areas. Many Afghans are illiterate and heavily influenced by religious extremists. Situated in the heart of Central Asia, Afghanistan continues to be a battleground for the geopolitical interests of various countries. It remains an attractive territory for the struggles of radical groups. Even today, armed conflicts persist in Afghanistan. Extremist ISIS militants and local partisans who oppose the Taliban continue to launch attacks. For building a modern Afghan society, it is necessary to invest in education, limit the influence of radical Islam, promote economic development, and elevate the role of culture. These challenges were daunting for the previous Afghan leadership, and humanitarian organizations have long been involved in addressing them. As for the country's new rulers, the Taliban, they are fervently building Afghanistan on the foundation of Sharia law, disregarding the modern world. Therefore, unfortunately, a brighter future for the Afghan land is postponed for at least another decade. To be continued.